This is the book Killing Hope, U.S. Military and CIA Interventions Since World War II, updated edition by William Blum. I think this book originally came out in the 1980s, and then there's been subsequent new editions coming out. This particular edition is from 2012, which I assume is the newest edition, although it will have 12 years of military interventions and chicanery on the part of the U.S. that is not included. I don't know what's going to happen when William Blum dies. Someone has to take over updating this book, updating this record of U.S. Malicious actions around the world, because obviously they're not stopping. SubhanAllah, I'm just going through the table of contents, scrolling down so that I can get to where I need to read. This is a catalog of crimes that just seems endless, and yet it's also 12, as I say, a dozen years of crimes have not been included in this edition. Right, okay, introduction. Begins with excerpts from the introduction from the 1987 edition. This man has been writing about this since 1987. I think that he used to work with the CIA, if I'm not mistaken. I think William Blum used to be with the CIA. A brief history of the Cold War and anti-communism, so-called anti-communism. He begins with a quote from Michael Parenti, who I think is a communist historian or Marxist historian in the U.S. Parenti says, our fear that communism might someday take over most of the world blinds us to the fact that anti-communism already has. This seems a kind of a strange way to frame it, since anti-communism was only just a way of packaging imperialism, but there you have it. Okay. It was in the early days of the fighting in Vietnam, the Viet Cong officer said to his American prisoner, "You were our heroes after the war. We read American books and saw American films, and a common phrase in those days was, quote, to be as rich and as wise as an American." So what happened? Well, they say never meet your heroes, eh? When they come off of the silver screen and come into your home, it's a bit different. An American might have been asked something similar by a Guatemalan, by an Indonesian, or a Cuban during the 10 years previous, or by a Uruguayan, or a Chilean, or a Greek in the decades subsequent. The remarkable international goodwill and credibility enjoyed by the United States at the close of the Second World War was dissipated country by country, intervention by intervention. The opportunity to build the war-ravaged world anew, to lay the foundations for peace, prosperity, and justice, collapsed under the awful weight of anti-communism. Again, anti-communism, just Western imperialism, how they packaged it. The weight had been accumulating for some time, indeed, since day one of the Russian Revolution. Okay, this seems peculiarly interested in the communist aspect here and anti-communist aspect here. I'm not sure if William Blum is a communist, but it seems to be leaning that way. I don't remember it having that particular tone when I read it the first time decades ago. By the summer of 1918, 13,000 American troops could be found in the newly born state, the future Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. 2 years and thousands of casualties later, the American troops left, having failed in their mission to, quote, strangle at its birth the Bolshevik state, as Winston Churchill put it. The young Churchill was Great Britain's Minister for War and Air during the Minister for Air. How do you minister for air? All right, I assume that means air, war by means of the air or through the air. Okay, anyway, sorry. The young Churchill was Great Britain's Minister for War and Air during this period. Increasingly, it was he who directed the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Allies, Great Britain, the US, France, Japan, and several other nations, on the side of the counter-revolutionary, quote-unquote, White Army. Years later, Churchill, the historian, was to record his views of this singular affair for posterity. This is a quote from Churchill now. Were they, the Allies, at war with Soviet Russia? Certainly not. But they shot Soviet Russians at sight. They stood as invaders on Russian soil. They armed the enemies of the Soviet government. They blockaded its ports and sunk its battleships. They earnestly desired and schemed its downfall. But war, shocking. Interference, shame. It was, they repeated, a matter of indifference to them how Russians settled their internal affairs. They were impartial. Bang. Look, I mean, this is Churchill talking years later about their own hypocrisy, and in a way as if it's, in a very flippant manner, that yes, we lied about what we were doing. We were trying to destroy Soviet Russia, but we lied about it continuously. Isn't that funny? See, this is why when you read the history, then you can see them doing the same thing today, and years from now, maybe an Anthony Blinken will look back on it and say, "Well, yeah, we knew there was a genocide." Haha. This is how they are. What was there about the Bolshevik Revolution that so alarmed the most powerful nations in the world? What drove them to invade a land whose soldiers had recently fought alongside them for over 3 years and suffered more casualties than any other country on either side of the World War? Well, the Bolsheviks had the audacity to make a separate peace with Germany in order to take leave of a war that they regarded as imperialist and not in any way their war, and to try and rebuild a terribly weary and devastated Russia. But the Bolsheviks had displayed the far greater audacity of overthrowing a capitalist feudalist system and proclaiming the first socialist state in the history of the world. This was uppityness writ incredibly large. This was the crime the Allies had to punish, the virus which had to be eradicated lest it spread to their own people. Now, there's a valid argument there with regards to the rejection of capitalism. In this particular, how can I say this? I think that it has less to do with a rejection of capitalism as it has to do with an assertion of sovereignty and actual control over your own affairs. And it's not the communism or the so-called communism, the so-called socialism that they objected to, as much as it was the fact that it locked them out of whatever Russia or the Soviet Union might have had to offer. That's my commentary. The invasion did not achieve its immediate purpose, but its consequences were nonetheless profound and persist to the present day. Professor D.F. Fleming, the Vanderbilt University historian of the Cold War, has noted, "For the American people, the cosmic tragedy of the interventions in Russia does not exist, or it was an unimportant incident long forgotten. But for the Soviet people and their leaders, the period was a time of endless killing, of looting, of plague and famine, of measureless suffering for the scores of millions, an experience burned into the very soul of a nation, not to be forgotten for many generations, if ever. Also, for many years, the harsh Soviet regimentations could also be justified by fear that the capitalist powers would be back to finish the job. It's not. It is not strange that in his address in New York, September 1959, Premier Khrushchev should remind us of the interventions. Quote, "The time you sent your troops to quell the revolution," as he put it. So that's also. This is now I'm breaking off into my own commentary. This is an important thing for people to remember today. And for America, this is another sign of what we've talked about many times, which is how the American people are disconnected from the reality and from the reality of the consequences overseas of their actions overseas. They really don't understand the impact that their policies have on people around the world. And we're seeing that compounding and compounding and compounding over the decades, to where people are increasingly sick to death of the United States. And meanwhile, the American people themselves are completely oblivious about that fact. They really don't know how they're perceived internationally, because they don't even understand the impact of their own policies and their own violence and savagery on these countries, on countries all around the world, whereas those countries have suffered the consequences of American policies, of American military interventions, and so forth. So it's burned, as it says here, burned into their very souls. But the American people they're not even aware of what they themselves have done, what their government has done, and what the ramifications of that are with regards to the way everyone around the world sees them. Okay, continuing. In what could be taken as a portent of superpower insensitivity, a 1920 Pentagon report on the intervention, this is the intervention in Russia, reads, this expedition affords one of the finest examples in history of honorable, unselfish dealings under very difficult circumstances to be helpful to a people struggling to achieve new liberty. Well, doesn't that just sound like America in Bangladesh or anywhere else? It sounds just like what they would say about Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else that they invaded that no one asked them to come. It's unselfish of us to invade your home. Okay, continuing. History does not tell us what a Soviet Union allowed to develop in quote-unquote normal ways, in a quote-unquote normal way of its own choosing would look like today. That's valid. We do know, however, that the nature of the Soviet Union attacked in its cradle, raised alone in an extremely hostile world, and when it managed to survive to adulthood, overrun by the Nazi war machine with the blessings of the Western powers. We know what that looked like. The resulting insecurities and fears have inevitably led to deformities of character, not unlike that found in an individual raised in a similarly life-threatening manner. I hope that was clear, although I didn't read it very well. It's saying that we don't know what the Soviet Union would have looked like if it had been allowed to grow and develop without Western interference. But we know how it has developed since as a result of or under the influence of Western interference, which ultimately was not a particularly healthy society. We in the West are never allowed to forget the political shortcomings, real and bogus, of the Soviet Union. At the same time, we are never reminded of the history which lies behind it. The anti-communist propaganda campaign began even earlier than the military intervention. Before the year 1918 was over, expressions in the vein of quote-unquote red peril, the Bolshevik assault on civilization, and quote, a menace to the world by Reds is seen, had become commonplace in the pages of the New York Times. So as far back as you go, the New York Times was just an instrument of state propaganda, still is today. During February and March 1919, a U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee held hearings, this is 1919, a U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee held hearings before which many quote-unquote Bolshevik horror stories were presented. The character of some of the testimony can be gauged by the headline in the usually sedate Times of 12 February 1919. This is a headline. Describe horrors under Red Rule. R.E. Simmons and W.W. Welsh tell senators of brutalities of Bolsheviks, Bolsheviki, strip women in the streets, people of every class except the scum are subjected to violence by mobs. That's interesting. People of every class except the scum. The Times is referring to scum as an official class within society, and only the scum have not been subjected to violence by the mobs. In other words, only people like you and I, people who read the Times. Historian Frederick Lewis Schuman has written, quote, the net result of these hearings was to picture Soviet Russia as a kind of bedlam inhabited by abject slaves, completely at the mercy of an organization of homicidal maniacs whose purpose was to destroy all traces of civilization and carry the nation back to barbarism. Kind of like how the Muslims want to return the whole world back to the 6th century. literally no story about the Bolsheviks was too contrived, too bizarre, too grotesque, or too perverted to be printed and widely believed. From women being nationalized to babies being eaten. That's one that always comes up, by the way, eating babies in their propaganda about their enemies. As the early pagans believed the Christians guilty of devouring their children, the same was believed of the Jews in the Middle Ages, and then they said the same thing about the so-called Bolsheviks. I'm surprised they haven't said that about us yet. The story about women with all the lurid connotations of state property, compulsory marriage, and so on, free love, etc., was broadcasted over the country through thousands of channels, wrote Schumann, and perhaps did more than anything to stamp the Russian communists in the minds of most American citizens as criminal perverts. Although, in fact, the Russian aristocracy was documented to be quite bizarre in their shall we say, relationships and proclivities. Anyway, this tale continued to receive great currency even after the State Department was obliged to announce that it was a fraud. That the Soviets eat their babies was still being taught by the John Birch Society to its large audience at least as late as 1978. So some 50 years, 60 years later. By the end of 1919, when the defeat of the Allies and the so-called White Army appeared likely, the New York Times treated its readers to headlines and stories such as the following. December 30th, 1919. Reds seek war with America. January 9th, 1920. Official quarters describes the Bolsheviks' menace in the Middle East as ominous. January 11, 1920. Allied officials and diplomats envisage a possible invasion of Europe. Doesn't this sound familiar? Doesn't this sound familiar with regards to what they're saying right now about Russia? January 13th, 1920. Allied diplomatic circles fear an invasion of Persia. In January 16th, 1920, a page one headline, 8 columns wide. Britain facing war with Reds. Calls council in Paris. Well-informed diplomats expect both a military invasion of Europe and a Soviet advance into Eastern and Southern Asia. The following morning, however, we could read, quote, no war with Russia. Allies to trade with allies will trade with Russia. So yesterday, they're about to invade everybody. Today, forget about it. There's not gonna be a war. We'll trade with them. Kind of like how they're still using Russian oil and Russian gas in Europe, even though they said that they're not. February 7th, 1920. Reds raising army to attack India. February 11th, 1920. Fear that Bolsheviks will now invade Japanese territory. Well, they're going everywhere. They're about to attack everywhere in the world. Meanwhile, that's in 1920. Meanwhile, just 15 years later, your problem is in Germany and you've been ignoring it. Readers of the New York Times were asked to believe that all these invasions were to come from a nation that was shattered as few nations in history have been, a nation still recovering from a horrendous world war in extreme chaos from a fundamental social revolution that was barely off the ground, engaged in a brutal civil war against forces backed by the major powers of the world. Its industries never advanced to begin with, in a shambles, and the country was in the throes of a famine that was to leave many millions dead before it subsided. So, in other words, he's telling you what the real situation was in Russia at that time, and therefore how ludicrous it was to pretend that Russia even had the power to carry out all of these aggressions that they were alleging Russia was planning on doing. In 1920, the New Republic magazine, which still exists today and is just as bad now as it was then, in 1920, the New Republic magazine presented a lengthy analysis of the news coverage by the New York Times of the Russian Revolution and the intervention. Amongst much else, it observed that in the 2 years following the November 1917 revolution, the Times had stated no less than 91 times that, quote, the Soviets were nearing their rope's end or actually had reached it. If this was reality as presented by the United States, the United States newspaper of record, that's the New York Times, that's referred to as the newspaper of record. If this is the reality that was presented by the New York Times, one can only imagine with dismay the witch's brew that the rest of the nation's newspapers were feeding their readers. This, then, was the American people's first experience of a new social phenomenon that had come upon the world, their introductory education about the Soviet Union and this thing called, quote-unquote, communism. The students have never recovered from that lesson. Neither has the Soviet Union. The military intervention came to an end, but with the sole and partial exception of the Second World War period, the propaganda offensive. The war itself came to an end, the intervention came to an end, but the propaganda offensive has never let up. In 1943, Life magazine devoted an entire issue in honor of the Soviet Union's accomplishments, going far beyond what was demanded by the need for wartime solidarity, going so far as to call Lenin, quote, perhaps the greatest man of modern times. So that's when you needed them for the Second World War. Then you completely reversed and flipped your propaganda and started praising them. 2 years later, however, with Harry Truman sitting in the White House, such fraternity had no chance of surviving Truman. After all, Truman was the man who, the day after the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, said, if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, then we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious in any circumstances. So you see how that was a thinking of Truman. If Germany is winning, then we'll help Russia. And if Russia is winning, then we'll help Germany. The main thing that we want to do is to just see them killing each other. And believe me, that's the same way that they feel right now. Much propaganda mileage has been squeezed out of the Soviet-German Treaty of 1939, made possible only by entirely ignoring the fact that the Russians were forced into the pact by the repeated refusal of the Western powers, particularly the United States and Great Britain, to unite with Moscow in a stand against Hitler. As they likewise refused to come to the aid of the socialist-oriented Spanish government, under siege by the German, Italian, and Spanish fascists beginning in 1936. Stalin realized that if the West wouldn't save Spain, they certainly wouldn't save the Soviet Union. From the Red Scare of the 1920s to the McCarthyism of the 1950s to the Reagan crusade against the so-called evil empire of the 1980s, the American people have been subjected to a relentless anti-communist indoctrination. It is imbibed with their mother's milk. Pictures in their comic books, spelled out in their school books, their daily paper offers them headlines that tell them all they need to know. Ministers find sermons in it, politicians are elected with it, and Reader's Digest becomes rich on it. In other words, this so-called anti-communist propaganda and indoctrination by the U.S., which again, as I said at the beginning, is actually nothing but a way of packaging or a way of covering up and a way of rationalizing and excusing American imperialism. It actually doesn't have much to do with communism, and certainly hasn't much to do with the Soviet Union. This may not be the view of the author, who may or may not be himself a communist or Marxist. I really don't know. But the way this is being told is as if communism is really a thing, and was really the anti-communism was really what was the incentive and what was motivating the Americans, when actually it had very little to do with that. It had only to do with American hegemony. The fiercely held conviction inevitably produced by this insidious assault upon the intellect is that a great damnation has been unleashed upon the world, possibly by the devil himself, but in the form of people not motivated by the same needs, fears, emotions, and personal morality that governs others of the species, but people engaged in an extremely clever, monolithic, international conspiracy dedicated to taking over the world and enslaving it. for reasons not always clear perhaps, but evil needs no motivation save evil itself. Well, that's quite a sermon that he just preached there. Nevertheless, it does seem to be true. And there he's basically saying what I just said, which is that this was just a cover. The communism, anti-communism paradigm was just a way of covering up their own actual imperial ambitions. Moreover, any appearance or claim by these people to be rational human beings seeking a better kind of world or society is a sham, a cover-up, to delude others, and proof only of their cleverness. The repression and cruelties which have taken place in the Soviet Union are forever proof of the bankruptcy of virtue and the evil intentions of these people in whichever country they may be found, under whatever name they may call themselves. And most important of all, the only choice open to anyone in the United States is between the American way of life and the Soviet way of life. That nothing lies between or beyond these two ways of making the world. This is how it looks to the simple folk of America. One finds that the sophisticated, when probed slightly beneath the surface of their academic language, see it exactly the same way. So in other words, he's saying that everybody thinks this way in America, simple people and academics, but academics anyway tend to be more brainwashed and more indoctrinated than so-called uneducated people, in my opinion. To the mind carefully brought to adulthood in the United States, the truths of anti-communism are self-evident as the flatness of the world once was to an earlier mind. As the Russian people believed that the victims of Stalin's purges were truly guilty of treason. The foregoing slice of American history must be taken into account if one is to make sense of the vagaries of American foreign policy since the end of World War II, specifically the record as presented in this book of what the U.S. military and the CIA and other branches of the U.S. government have done to the peoples of the world. In 1918, the barons of American capital needed no reason for their war against communism other than the threat to their wealth and their privilege, although their opposition was expressed in terms of moral indignation. And again, that's the same thing that they do today. During the period between the two world wars, U.S. gunboat diplomacy operated in the Caribbean to make, quote, the American lake safe for the fortunes of United Fruit and the W.R. Grayson Company, at the same time taking care to warn of the Bolshevik threat to all that is decent from the likes of Nicaraguan rebel Augusto Sandino. By the end of the Second World War, every American past the age of 40 had been subjected to some 25 years of anti-communist radiation. The average incubation period needed to produce a malignancy. Anti-communism, so-called, had developed a life of its own, independent of its capitalist father. Increasingly, in the post-war period, middle-aged Washington policymakers and diplomats saw the world out there as one composed of, quote, communists and anti-communists, whether of nations, movements, or individuals. This comic strip vision of the world, with righteous American supermen fighting against communism, communist evil everywhere, had graduated from a cynical propaganda exercise to a moral imperative of U.S. foreign policy. I think that's well said. Even the concept of, and that touches upon something that we've talked about before, which is that when you begin to propagandize your population, you yourself may know that what you're doing is propaganda, but what inevitably happens is that you raise a whole generation of people on propaganda who then believe that propaganda, and then they start to operate in the world. Once they inherit the reins of power, they operate in the world as if that propaganda is true. So generation by generation, you are creating people who end up having positions of power and authority who are increasingly disconnected from reality. They're informed about reality exclusively by propaganda. So by generation after generation, they are more and more disconnected from the world and how the world actually operates. Okay. Even the concept of non-communist, implying some measure of neutrality, has generally been accorded scant legitimacy in this paradigm. John Foster Dulles, one of the major architects of post-war U.S. foreign policy, expressed this succinctly in his typically simple moralistic way. Quote, "For us, there are two sorts of people in the world. There are those who are Christians and support free enterprise, and there are the others." As several of the case studies in the present book confirm, Dulles put that creed into rigid practice. The word communist, as well as Marxist, has been so overused and so abused by American leaders and by the media as to render it virtually meaningless. The left has done the same with the word fascist, by the way, he said. This is the author, not me, but I agree. But merely, there's so many words, actually. Fascist, oligarchy, and in fact, genocide is a word that is overused to the point that it loses meaning, to where you could say that, you know, that in Bangladesh, there's a genocide going on because they kill protesters. No, that's not how it works. These words do have actual meanings, and you should be familiar with them so that you use the words correctly, if you have any respect for the severity of what those words actually implies. But merely having a name for something, witches or flying saucers, attaches a certain credence to it. This is going back to the book. At the same time, the American public, as we have seen, has been soundly conditioned to react in a Pavlovian way to the term communism or anti-communism. It means still the worst excesses of Stalin. Communism means the worst excesses of Stalin. This is what you find also anytime Jordan Peterson talks about Soviet Russia or talks about communism or even socialism. He even says it's socialism. Socialism is responsible for all of the crimes of Stalin. From wholesale purges in Siberian slave labor camps is what it means. As Michael Parenti has observed, that, quote, the classic Marxist-Leninist predictions concerning world revolution are treated as statements of intent, directing all present-day communists to actions, or all present-day communist actions. It means us against them. In other words, because if you're, I'm not particularly familiar, to be honest, with Marxism and Leninism. I haven't read much. I never read Marx. I've read about these things. And I'm familiar with the fact that they think that a worldwide revolution is an inevitability. A socialist or Marxist or communist revolution is an inevitability, but there's not necessarily the belief that that's something that you're supposed to pursue. It's something that they thought that Marx thought was going to happen naturally. But when they talk about it, he's saying in the West, when they talk about it, they act like it was that it was their intention, that it was something that they wanted to accomplish by aggression and by action. But let's be honest, there are a lot who have felt that way and who have, in fact, tried to achieve it by means of violence and aggression. Okay, continuing with the book. And, quote, them, unquote, can mean a peasant in the Philippines. When we're talking about us versus them can mean a peasant in the Philippines, a mural painter in Nicaragua, a legally elected prime minister in British Guyana, or a European intellectual, or a Cambodian neutralist, or an African nationalist, all somehow part of the same monolithic conspiracy, each in some way a threat to the American way of life. No land too small, too poor, or too far away to pose such a threat, the communist threat. In other words, what he's saying here, although he may elaborate on it and articulate it more further down, this is something that I've also talked about before, at least I think in some of the book discussions or some of the other discussions, which is that they attach the word communist to people who aren't really even communist, people who are just pro their own people. They may be, as he said, an African nationalist. They may be an intellectual or even neutral. But because of the way John Foster Dulles said, you're either exactly what we are or you're something else. And that something else is the word that we will always use for that something else is just communist. The cases presented in this book illustrate that it has been largely irrelevant whether the particular targets of intervention, be they individuals, political parties, movements, or governments, call themselves communist or not. That doesn't matter. It has mattered little whether they were scholars of dialectical materialism or had never heard of Karl Marx, whether they were atheists or priests, whether a strong and influential communist party was in the picture or not, whether the government had come into being through violent revolution or peaceful elections. All have been targets. All have been communist in the American mentality and the American rationale for their imperialist aggression. It has mattered still less that the Soviet KGB was in the picture. The assertion has been frequently voiced that the CIA carries out its dirty tricks largely in reaction to operations of the KGB, which have been even dirtier. This is the allegation. This is the author talking. This is a lie made out of whole cloth. There may be an isolated incident of such in the course of the CIA's life, but it has kept itself well hidden. The relationship between the two sinister agencies is marked by fraternization and respect for fellow professionals more than by hand-to-hand combat. Former CIA officer John Stockwell has written, this is a quote, actually, at least in more routine operations, CIA officers, case officers, fear the U.S. ambassador, fear the U.S. ambassador's staff, they fear restrictive headquarters, cables, curious, gossipy neighbors in the local community. They fear all of those as potential threats to their operation. Next, after all of those potential threats to their operation, they see the local police as a threat to their operation. Then the media, the press. And last of all, on their list of potential threats to their operations is the KGB. In my 12 years of case officering, I never saw or heard of a situation in which the KGB attacked or obstructed a CIA operation. Stockwell adds that the various intelligence agencies do not want their world to be complicated by murdering each other. It isn't done, he says. This is a quote by Stockwell, who was a former CIA officer. It isn't done. If a CIA case officer has a flat tire in the dark night on a lonely road, he will not hesitate to accept a ride from a KGB officer. Likely the two would detour to some bar for a drink together. In fact, CIA and KGB officers entertain each other frequently in their homes. The CIA's files are full of mention of such relationships in almost every African station. Proponents of quote-unquote fighting fire with fire come perilously close at times to arguing that if the KGB, for example, had a hand in the overthrow of a Czechoslovak government in 1968, it is okay for the CIA to have a hand in the overthrow of a Chilean government in 1973. It's as if the destruction of democracy by the KGB deposits funds in a bank account from which the CIA is then justified in making withdrawals. That's a clever way of putting it. What then has been the thread common to the diverse targets of American intervention, which has brought down upon them the wrath and often the firepower of the world's most powerful nation? In virtually every case involving the third world, so-called third world, described in this book, it has been, in one form or another, a policy of self-determination, the desire born of perceived need and principle to pursue a path of development independent of U.S. foreign policy objectives. Most commonly, this has been manifested in A, the ambition to free themselves from economic and political subservience to the United States, or B, the refusal to minimize relations with the socialist bloc, or suppress the left at home, or welcome an American military installation on their soil. In short, to any refusal to be a pawn in the Cold War, or option C, the attempt to alter or replace a government which held to neither of these aspirations, i.e. a government supported by the United States. In other words, again, it's just any form of self-determination, any sort of independence, sovereignty, exactly what our goals in Middle Nation are to promote economic sovereignty and political independence. Any country that is following or pursuing those objectives in the days of the Cold War, those kinds of countries were deemed to be communist and therefore needed to be maliciously dealt with, aggressively dealt with. It cannot be emphasized too strongly, going back to the book, it cannot be emphasized too strongly that such a policy of independence has been viewed and expressed by numerous third world leaders, so-called third world leaders, and revolutionaries, as one not to be equated by definition to anti-Americanism or pro-communism, but as simply a determination to maintain a position of neutrality and non-alignment vis-a-vis the two superpowers. Time and time again, however, it will be seen that the United States was not prepared to live with this proposition. Arbenz in Guatemala, Mossadegh in Iran, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nkrumah in Ghana, Jagan in British Guyana, Sihanouk of Cambodia, all insisted, Uncle Sam insisted, all of those must declare themselves unequivocally on the side of, quote, the free world, or suffer the consequences. Kwame Nkrumah put the case for non-alignment as follows. The experiment which we tried in Ghana was essentially one of developing the country in cooperation with the world as a whole. Non-alignment meant exactly what it said. We were not hostile to the countries of the socialist world in the way in which the governments of the old colonial territories were. It should be remembered that while Britain pursued at home coexistence with the Soviet Union, this was never allowed to extend to British colonial territories. Books on socialism, which were published and circulated freely in Britain, were banned in British colonial empire, in the British colonial empire. And after Ghana became independent, it was assumed abroad that it would continue to follow the same restrictive ideological approach. When we behaved as did the British in their relations with the socialist countries, we were accused of being pro-Russian and of introducing the most dangerous ideas into Africa. You see the hypocrisy? Britain was dealing with Russia. Britain had relations with Russia. But if Ghana, when it became independent from Britain, if they were to have relations with Russia, then they were accused of being pro-Russian and of being pro-communist and aligning themselves with them. You're not allowed to not align with the West and not be subservient to the West, even if you're so-called independent. It's reminiscent of the 19th century American South, where many Southerners were deeply offended that so many of their black slaves had deserted to the northern side in the Civil War. Subhanallah. They had genuinely thought that the blacks should have been grateful for all their white masters, for everything that their white masters had done for them, and that they were happy and content with their lot. They really believed that. The noted Louisiana surgeon and psychologist, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, argued that many of the slaves suffered from a form of mental illness, which he called drapetomania, diagnosed as the uncontrollable urge to escape from slavery. They subhanAllah, they actually had a doctor saying that it was some kind of a psychological condition, some kind of a disorder psychologically, to try to escape from slavery. In the second half of the 20th century, this illness, this so-called illness, in the third world has usually been called communism. Perhaps the most deeply ingrained reflex of knee-jerk anti-communism is the belief that the Soviet Union or Cuba or Vietnam, etc., are acting as Moscow's surrogates, is a clandestine force lurking behind the facade of self-determination, stirring up the hydra of revolution or just plain trouble here, there, and everywhere. Yet another incarnation, although on a far grander scale, of the proverbial outside agitator, he who made his appearance regularly throughout history. King George blamed the French for inciting the American colonies to revolt. Disillusioned American farmers and veterans protesting their onerous economic circumstances after the revolution, Shays Rebellion, were branded as British agents out to wreck the new republic. Labor strikes in the late 19th century, in late 19th century America, labor strikes were blamed on anarchists and foreigners. During the First World War, on German agents. After the war, on Bolsheviks. In other words, labor strikes in the late 19th century were blamed on anarchists and foreigners. And then during the First World War, labor strikes were blamed on German agents. And then after the war, it was blamed on Bolsheviks. It was never the fact that workers were oppressed. They never had reason. They always had to be agitated. And in the 1960s, said the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, founded the FBI, helped to spread the view among the police ranks that any kind of mass protest is due to a conspiracy promulgated by agitators, often communists, who misdirect otherwise contented people. The last is the key phrase, one which encapsulates the conspiracy mentality of those in power. The idea that no people, except those living under the enemy, could be so miserable and so discontent as to need recourse to revolution or even mass protest. That's only the agitation of an outsider, which misdirects them along this path. They do the same thing until now. They do the same thing until now. Everything is the Russians are behind it. Now the Iranians are behind it. For example, even the assassination attempt on Trump. That was Iran, right? That was the Russians. That was something. Nobody would ever just do anything like that in American society. Everyone's happy. Accordingly, if Ronald Reagan were to concede that the masses of El Salvador have every good reason to rise up against their god-awful existence, it would bring into question his accusation and the rationale for U.S. intervention, that it is principally only the Soviet Union and its Cuban and Nicaraguan allies who instigate the Salvadorians. That seemingly magical power of communists, everywhere who, with a twist of their red wrist, can transform peaceful, happy people into furious guerrillas. The CIA knows how difficult a feat that is. The agency, as we shall see, tried to spark mass revolt in China, mass revolt in Cuba and in the Soviet Union, in Albania and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, with a singular lack of success. The agency's scribes, they've gotten better at it, by the way, in terms of regime change and fake revolution and rebellion, they've gotten better at it. The agency's scribes have laid the blame for their failures on the quote-unquote closed nature of the societies involved. But in non-communist countries, the CIA has had to resort to military coups or extra-legal chicanery to get its people into power. It has never been able to light the fire of popular revolution. The CIA has never been able to light the fire of popular revolution. I think that's probably still true to a certain extent. But what they are able to do is light the fire, light a fake fire that is convincing as a popular revolution, which gives them the opportunity to exploit that that image of a popular revolution for them to engineer regime change in the behind the facade that they've created of a popular revolution. Now back to the book. For Washington to concede merit and virtue to a particular third world insurgency would moreover raise the question, why does not the United States, if it must intervene, take the side of the rebels? Not only might this better serve the cause of human rights and justice, but it would shut out the Russians from their alleged role. What better way to frustrate the international communist conspiracy? But this is a question that dares not speak its name in the Oval Office, a question that is relevant to many of the cases in this book. You see their point. they're saying that the communists are behind revolutions here, there, and everywhere. Well, why didn't America just take the side of the people and appropriate those so-called people's movements? They were actually they're alleging that those people's movements were actually being engineered by the communists. Well, why didn't the Americans just come in and get on the side of the people instead of always being on the other side? I mean, you could ask that question right now, because America, for example, with the Houthis in Yemen, you've got all of your fleet over there. You've got the Sixth Fleet over there. You've got the Navy over there, and you're over there to try to stop the Houthis. Well, you should be doing their job. The American fleet should be the one that's putting an embargo and a blockade on Israel. You should be putting a no-fly zone over Israel, and you should be doing what the Houthis are doing, rather than trying to stop the Houthis from doing what they're doing. Instead, the United States remains committed to its all too familiar policy of establishing and or supporting the most vile tyrannies in the world, whose outrages against their own people confront us daily in the pages of our newspapers. Brutal massacres, systematic, sophisticated torture, public whippings, soldiers and police firing into crowds. This is happening even in Europe now. Government-supported death squads, tens of thousands of disappeared persons, extreme economic deprivation, a way of life that is virtually a monopoly held by America's allies, from Guatemala, Chile, and El Salvador to Turkey, back at the time that this was written, Pakistan, and Indonesia, again, back at the time when this was written, all members in good standing of the so-called Holy War against Communism, all members of the so-called free world, that region of which we hear so much but see so little. The restrictions on civil liberties found in the communist bloc, as severe as they are, pale in comparison to the cottage industry Auschwitzes of the so-called free world, and except in that curious mental landscape inhabited by the complete anti-communist, can have little or nothing to do with the sundry American interventions supposedly in the cause of a higher good. It is interesting to note that, as commonplace as it is for American leaders to speak of freedom and democracy while supporting dictatorships, so do Russian leaders speak of wars of liberation, anti-imperialism, and anti-colonialism while doing extremely little to actually further these causes, American propaganda notwithstanding. The Soviets like to be thought of as champions of the third world, but they have stood by, doing little more than going tisk-tisk as progressive movements and governments. Even communist parties in Greece, Guatemala, British Guyana, Chile, Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere have gone to the wall with American complicity. And that's where we're going to finish. Now I'm on page 20. All right. Jazakallah khair, everyone. Sorry I talked so much. Barakallahu fikum. Inshallah, we'll do it again tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.